Hey there, I'm Jackie Ferris. This week on the 302, we're talking about the history of pirateering. From Captain Kidd to Blackbeard and even some local pirates, tales of swashbuckling adventures and hidden treasures. Get ready to walk the plank. The 302 is headed your way. The golden age of piracy started in 1690 and lasted roughly 40 years, and many of the most well-known pirates terrorized Delaware shores. Now, there's no better place to talk about the history of piracy than the Discoversea Shipwreck Museum in Fenwick Island. I'm joined now by the owner, Dale Clifton. Dale, thank you so much for coming on our show once again to talk about the history of piracy. Now, I know a lot of folks think of pirates like Johnny Depp or, some of the characters that we read about in books, but these were actual people. Yes.
To start off with, I think for most people to understand pirates, they have to understand kind of a general history of the pirates. It all really started with the War of the Spanish Succession, and that started and lasted about 12 years. And at the end of that 12 years, a lot of these men were unemployed. So the King of England, who could not afford his own navy at the time, started giving letters of marque to general sailors. And we know that there was probably a little over 5,000 of those letters of marque given to general seamen or general sailors. And then them and their men could legally go hunt the enemy. And their job was to plunder those ships of England's enemies, mainly to try to kind of upset their commerce of the day. Most of this really started because in 1700, when the then king died, basically he had no heirs. And because of that, he gave the kingdom of England, or excuse me, of Spain, to a French person. So now when they looked at Spain and France being together as a union, it did a very big threat to the other European nations. So the War of Spanish Succession really started as that. These men who were actually given the letters of marque were to go out and plunder any ship they could, and as long as it was an enemy ship, that letter gave them legality to do that. Unfortunately, when the war ended, out of the 50-some thousand men that we know, there were only about roughly 1,400 of them who were kept in the actual Navy itself. So now this gave a period of time where large groups of men who knew nothing more than how to sail, how to plunder, how to rob, were unemployed, and they figured, well, we still have our ships, let's go out and do it on our own. And they changed from privateering, which what they were called when they had their letter marque, to actual pirates.
So when we talk about these fellows, we know that there were some of the big names here on our shores in Delaware, from Captain Kidd, who was really early, all the way to Blackbeard. So talk to us a little bit about some of the big names that we've seen here.
The first tales we know of piracy in this area, as far as being documented, was around 1672. And there was actually a group of pirates that came into Lewis, Delaware, and they actually ransacked the town so much they stole everything that they could walk away with, including the food in the cupboards. And after that happened, basically because we didn't have large militias along our own coast to protect us, basically most of those people that were around the town of Lewis who were Quakers were then ordered to carry guns or have guns available to kind of offset any future pirate attacks. But pirates like Blackbeard and Captain Kidd, when he was captured and taken to England to be hung, he actually tried to barter with his life of telling of a treasure that he had stashed off Gardiner's Island out of New York. And he also talked about a treasure he had buried along Cape Henlopen, in which is present-day Lewis. So we know that they did occupy this area. Even in the Chesapeake Bay, there was a small island that used to exist there called Watts Island. and a lot of those more well-known pirates actually did come as far up as the Chesapeake Bay because it was easy plundering along our coast. We didn't have large militias, and all of this activity of all these ships that were coming from all over the world going to Philadelphia at the time, there was no one here to protect them.
Now, you make a business, I guess it started as a passion and kind of made its way into a business of shipwrecks and recovering items from shipwrecks, and you're actually working on one that's connected to pirates, is that right?
Yeah, it's kind of unusual. A lot of people don't realize the big name pirates like Blackbeard, William Jennings, and some of the more well-known pirates all really got their start because when the war ended and all these men decided to become pirates, one of the first big news stories of the day was in 1715, the Spanish treasure fleet of 1715 sank off the east coast of Florida. Now, this was millions and millions of dollars worth of gold, and that's millions in that time in history. So once this story spread around, all of these men who had now become pirates decided to go down and try to plunder those ships and get as much treasure from them as they could. Some of the more well-known ones were there, Blackbeard, you know, all those different ones. By that time, Captain Kidd had already been hung because he was hung around 1700. But William Jennings, which was one of the more well-known pirates of the day, and it was actually the mentor of Blackbeard and Sam Bellamy, was able to actually go in and actually capture one of the salvage camps, and he made away with a large amount of that treasure. Once the pirates found it wasn't quite as easy to dive for, you know, they were used to overtaking ships and taking the treasure, they basically started, under Benjamin Hornigold, started places like, you know, Port Royal, Jamaica, which was already a pirate establishment of the day, but Martinique and Nassau, and all these pirates started to kind of conjugate down in the Caribbean region and start making plans of how they were going to plunder ships up and down the eastern seaboard and in the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of that treasure, some of which you have here on display. So we'll be right back.
I'm DJ Fazik with Coastal Cruises, and we love cruising with the 302.
Welcome back. We're talking about pirates, and now we're talking about some booty. We're joined by Dale Clifton. Dale, tell me exactly, it looks like I've got pieces of 8 here, right?
Yes.
So where did these come from exactly?
These actually came from a shipwreck that was off the coast of Virginia. The pirate pieces of 8, if everyone who's watched Johnny Depp's movie or Red Treasure Island, you've heard about the pirates with gold doubloons and pieces of 8. These were actually being made by the Spanish after the Spanish conquistadors came to the New World. This was a New World coinage. But they were really made popular by the pirates because when these were first minted, they weren't meant to be coins. It was a cheap way of hauling the raw gold and silver from one point to another point and keeping account by weight. But once pirates got a hold of these and figured out that this was gold and silver of a certain weight and they could use it as currency. And for over 350 years, no matter what country you went around the world, this was considered legal tender in all countries. And on one side of these, you'll have the Christian cross with the lions and castles, and on the back side would have been the shield of Spain, showing that this was property of Spain at that time.
Now, this is amazing here. This is a bar of gold. Where did you find this, and what's the significance of this?
That particular one came again from a wreck in Virginia, and this particular one, besides making this coinage, or these pieces of 8, many times the gold and silver that the Spanish, especially the Spanish conquistadors, were trying to mine here in the New World, they didn't know how to do it very well. So a lot of the gold that you're holding in your hand right now, even though it is gold, that is not really Spanish gold. That was actually Aztec gold. So when they came here, the ratio to gold to silver was 2 to 1 because they didn't know how to mine it very well. So once they got here and they found that the Aztecs, Peruvian Indians, had already mined a lot of this gold and made it into religious statues, they were trying to introduce Christianity into the Americas. So many times those statues were melted down and poured into what was called 1 or 2 finger bars. This is actually a 1 finger bar. They would pour a line into the wet sand and use that indentation as a mold to pour the molten gold into. But many of these things, they were melting down because they were trying to introduce Christianity, but they also did not want the king to know that they were stealing it. Because if they thought that they were mining it, they would send more money and manpower for the mining operations. It wasn't until about 1530 that the Spanish learned about mercury, and luckily for them, they owned the largest mercury mine in the world. So they started exporting mercury, and by taking mercury and mixing it with the gold and silver ores and burning the mercury off, it would give them higher concentrations of gold and silver, and overnight the ratio went from 2 to 1 to 16 to 1.
So tell me a little bit about the indentations here.
Yeah. Each bar, to give you an idea, if you find a gold bar and it's 2 pounds of gold and it has no markings on it, then you do the math. Let's say $2,000 an ounce into 2 pounds, it's worth its weight in gold. But if you find that same 2-pound gold bar and it has the markings, depending on the markings and what they represent, usually whatever the price of the gold is, start times that between 10 to 60 times. Now each one of the marks on this bar, these are the round tax stamps of the King of Spain, showing the King's royal fifth had been paid on that bar. The XX with 2 lines and 2 dots is 22.5 carats pure gold. This is the King's Assayer's mark, and then this is actually the person who owned this bar and their mark on the bar to show that it was property of that person.
Fantastic.
And these were favored by the pirates. This silver coins and gold coins and the gold bars, that's what they were really after.
Now you have something that's very interesting to tell us about, a ring. Now who did this ring belong to?
Well, these are very rare. I only have 3 of these in my collection, and I don't know of too many other ones that have ever been found, but these were actually pirate rings. If you think of the Masonic lodges of the day, most people always wear a Masonic ring. The pirates had something too, and this was rings like this that basically were the skull and crossbones. And the reason they wore this was pirates wore anyway lots of jewelry. They wore their wealth on them because they could pull something off and use it to pay for something. But the rings were important because let's say you were on a pirate crew and I was on another pirate crew and you hated me. And a fight broke out in a tavern, let's say in Port Royal, Jamaica. Even though you hated me, you could look around the room and anybody with one of these rings on, they had to come to your defense. Even though I may have not liked you, I wasn't standing up for you, I was standing up for the brotherhood of piracy. The other reason they wore the rings was because if I was a pirate captain and I was trying to get a crew together and I was going to try to overtake a Spanish treasure ship, I couldn't just go in and pick my crew at random. I had to make sure that you were a pirate yourself, because if I talked to our governor's man, I could be prosecuted or hung. So by knowing that you had this on, you were kind of the articles of piracy. You had a secrecy about what we were doing, and you would keep that secret to yourself.
So let's talk about, I guess, maybe the crown jewel, maybe not, the Blackbeard's sword. You actually have a sword that you believe belonged to Blackbeard?
Yes. When I found that sword, it was found near Blackbird Creek, which on the early maps and a lot of the legend and folklore, that used to be called Blackbeard Creek. And one of the reasons we know Blackbeard liked this area, other than supposedly one of his many wives lived on Assateague, was he liked the Delaware Bay because he knew a lot of these ships going up the Delaware Bay were not very well protected, but they had lots of cargo. So it was very easy for them to get their shallow draft boats in the shallower water, lay in wait, and when the ships would come by, they would kind of rush out and plunder the ships of their goods. The other reason he liked it is one of his first mate's name was Israel Hans, and Israel Hans had family on the Cape May side, so they knew if the law did get after them, they had friends in the area that would hide them out and help them get away.
So as far as the markings, how do you know by looking at it that it belonged to him?
Well, I didn't know.
Okay.
When I first found it, it is actually a boarding sword. It was a sword that was actually used not for fighting, but when you brought your ship up alongside an enemy ship, sometimes you didn't want to sink the ship. You wanted to overtake it as your own. So when you sent your pirate men aboard that ship to overtake it, one of the first duties as you were going aboard the ship, this is a very long blade, they would lunge it at the person, and it probably did a very good job going through them. But the other first duty that you had was to get the sail ropes down, because without the sails, the enemy ship couldn't sail away. So this was used with both hands to cut the sail ropes down. When I first found this, I contacted a friend of mine at the Smithsonian and told him where I had found it and what I thought it was, and he just basically said the only thing you can hope for is that it may have a 3-leaf clover design on it. And I said, why is that? And he said, because in my research I found that one of Blackbeard's marks was a 3-leaf clover design. The same as the King of England marked their weaponry with a broad arrow, he actually put a 3-leaf clover design, and in the handle guard itself, there is 2 3-leaf clover designs.
It's fascinating.
So, yeah.
Now, we've talked about some of the more famous pirates, but there were a lot of local pirates, and we're going to talk about that when we return.
I'm Ryan Grover, and I'm the director at Rockwood Park and Museum. And whenever I want to find out about all of my fellow museums and all the fantastic things they collect, I go to the 302.
Welcome back. We talked about Blackbeard. We also talked about Captain Kidd. But Dale, there were a lot of local pirates that were not only in the sea, but also on land.
Yes. Some of our more well-known local pirates were people like Blue Skin, and he actually was named that because he was actually shot a pistol very close to his face, and the gunpowder stained his face. His real name was Levi West, and he was actually the son of a miller that lived in Lewis, Delaware. He was well known for pirating from Lewis, Delaware, all the way down to the Virginia Capes. We also have the Colburn family. They were known to be in piracy. We had the Parker family. But probably one of the more famous ones that is known is a pirate by the name of Charles Wilson. And many years ago, a letter was found in an English courthouse that he had written to his brother back in 1750, telling him where he had buried a treasure on Assateague Island. And many people have gone and tried to find that treasure. Some of it, I would say, has been found, but a lot of it has not been found because a lot of people don't have all the information that they really need to look for that. But we also had something here called land pirates and mooncussers. You got to remember at that time when the Spanish Succession War ended, like I was speaking of earlier, a lot of our local people were out of work. They were unemployed. So you've heard the expression buccaneer? Mm-hmm. Well, buccaneers were actually, some of the earliest accounts I can find of where they were called that was off of Watts's Island and down off the Barrier Islands of Virginia. And in the early days, ships would actually unload cargoes of cows, pigs, on a lot of the Barrier Islands. They didn't need any fences, and they could let them graze there. And when they were coming from the New World back to their old world in Europe, Spain, England, they could stop there and slaughter fresh meat for the return voyage across. Well, a lot of the locals who were poor decided this is free game. We can go out there and kill it, shoot it, eat it, and feed our own families. But they started grilling a lot of this food up on the Barrier Islands. And the contraption that they used, it was a French word, but it was called buccaw. And the buccaws became known as the buccaneers. And what they would do is grill this food up and flag down passing ships and sell them the meat from the actual Barrier Islands. So a lot of those men were considered pirates, but they weren't real pirates. Pirates would be being robbed at sea. But there again, we did have the mooncussers and the land pirates. And a lot of the people in this area know Nag's Head because of the land pirates in that area. But a lot of the land pirates in this area used the false lights of the lighthouses to actually coax the sea captains ashore and actually get them to wreck so they could go out and plunder their ships of their goods.
Now, one of the stories that I have been fascinated by, and you told us about this during our last visit, was the story of the wedge. Mm-hmm. Tell me about the wedge.
Well, the wedge also drew a lot of pirates to this area as well. But not just pirates. It drew every type of criminal that was out there. If you were a smuggler, if you were in trouble with the law. The boundaries disputes between Delaware, we had a boundary dispute from the western side, which became the Mason-Dixon line. Then there was a dispute between the Penn family and the Calvert family here in Fenwick, which was the Trans-Peninsula line. But when they went to make the line at the top of the state, once we were separating ourselves from the 3 lower counties of Pennsylvania, they decided the way to make that boundary mark was to go to the county courthouse in Newcastle and strike a 30-mile arc from the steeple of that. Well, when they did that, the one western border came down like this, and when they struck the arc, it came short. So they didn't know what they were going to do because it fell short, so they just kind of went like this and moved it over. And that little wedge of land at that time, which was about 100 acres, became a no man's land. No state owned it. And so if you were a criminal and you could make your way to that wedge, and once you stepped inside the wedge, no law could touch you. So pirates who were running from the law, they could go to the wedge. But any criminal or anyone with criminal activity, that was kind of a safe haven for them at that time. And
it was also the scene of a standoff, as it were. I guess there was a female pirate that was doing some unsavory things. Talk to us about that.
Well, yes and no. You've got the story right, but wrong.
Okay.
That same situation, that wasn't in the wedge, but that same situation happened over near Reliance, Delaware. And that was Patty Cannon. And Patty Cannon owned a tavern, and this was back in the time of the Civil War, so it was in the 1800s. But she used to sell a lot of the slaves off and then kill the plantation owners that were buying them so she could just take the money. And her tavern was built right on the line. Part of it was in Delaware and part was in Maryland. So when the Delaware sheriff would come to try to arrest her, she would step into the Maryland side and he couldn't touch her. And the same thing happened when the Worcester County sheriff came in. She would step in the Delaware side. And this went on for years. And finally they got smart enough to say, we've got to converge on her all at the same time. And that's what they did when they finally caught her.
So there's a lot of history here in Delaware and also here at the Discoversea Shipwreck Museum. So if people want to come, what can they see and when can they come see it?
Okay, well, we have a lot of new displays this year. We change our displays every January and February, so there's always something new to look at, and as we're finding new stuff, it goes on display here first. We're open every day from except for Wednesdays. We're closed on Wednesdays, but every day from 11 to 3. There's some days that we will actually go to 11 to 5, but you can always call ahead at our phone number and find out exactly what our hours are for the day that you'd like to come.
And I highly recommend that folks do that. I brought my husband here, as you remember, and we spent hours here and we had the best time. There's so much to see and do here. Thank you so much for spending time with us and telling us all about pirates.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. For more information on shipwrecks and pirates, you can visit Discoversea.com. That'll do it for this episode of the 302. We're going to leave you now with some beauty shots of the beach at Fenwick Island. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. Tell them you saw it on the 302.